Today, we're going to talk about the top 3 jaw-dropping moments in last week's Supreme Court hearing. Whether it was the moment when the left-wing justice tried to equate banning interracial marriage with protecting kids from invasive gender surgeries, or when Justice Alito eviscerated the Biden administration's attempt to claim these procedures overwhelmingly help kids. We highlight all those moments and more, plus what it means for Virginia law and families. Welcome to Speak Up Virginia, equipping you to speak up on the life, family, and freedom issues that matter most to you. From the Family Foundation, I'm your host, Candi Cushman, with our president, Victoria Cobb. Well, welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Speak Up Virginia. You'll notice we are on Zoom today, and that's because we had a little camera crisis. Apparently, the cold was just too much for the Family Foundation camera, and it refused to work. So thanks for bearing with us. Hopefully, we're back to normal format next week. But Victoria is here in the office with me, in case you were wondering. With that said, I did want to do one more little announcement, and that is if you want to work with us to get the truth out, to counteract all the lies we're hearing out there in culture, you can do that by sharing this podcast. All you have to do is go to familyfoundation.org, look for our YouTube channel, and share the Speak Up Virginia playlist. It's an easy way to help get the truth out about what's really going on and how it impacts Virginia. And also, if you know people that listen to things like Spotify and Apple, you can also share that and just take a moment to go on there and give us a 5-star review like on Apple, because that helps get the podcast out to more people. So thank you for partnering with us in that. And with that said, let's dive right into the topic. And that is this huge Supreme Court hearing that is still making news after happening last week. We are still getting the people just processing what happened and how it's going to impact things and what they think might happen. And just in a nutshell, what that is all about is whether states can have the freedom to have these do no harm type of laws that protect kids from being pushed by adults into these invasive, often life-altering gender transition procedures that often involve surgery. So specifically, what was involved was the state of Tennessee and whether they could have their do no harm law, their law protecting kids, so that you don't have 5-year-olds, for instance, being pushed by adults onto this conveyor belt type of pathway that just escalates them towards something drastic, like a child having their bodily organs removed. Victoria, what are you thinking about as we come out of that hearing that you were at personally, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a big case, United States versus Skermeti, and it's big because it's not only Tennessee that's passed the do no harm or help not harm bill, but it's actually a majority of the states now that have passed something like this. So there's a lot of states waiting to hear. And of course, even states like Virginia that haven't, we want that right to be able to do that as soon as our legislature gets its rational mind on. No, I'm just kidding. But as soon as we can get folks to come in line, we want to have that bill. And so this is a big deal. And again, it's just this idea that these kids, we just live in a world where kids are confused and they're struggling. And because we're a hyper-medicated kind of place, we're treating that. And it's been a big social experiment. And we have to come back to whether or not we are harming kids. And Tennessee, and we would contend, we are absolutely harming kids. And we have to stop this sort of it's $1 billion industry that is literally making profit and prioritizing that over sort of these kids.
Yeah. And I feel like the reason this is so important and could impact generations of kids, whatever they decide to do, is because at the heart of it, you really have leftists trying to constitutionalize another new right. They're always doing this. They're always trying to constitutionalize an issue so that it becomes a Roe v. Wade style mandate. And if they keep pushing on this and trying to constitutionalize these transgender issues so that it becomes like, a mandate into our healthcare with kids and into the whole issue on boys and girls sports and in locker rooms, all of that that is going to be huge. What are your thoughts along those lines of things as far as the 30,000-foot impact of this?
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to contend that somehow to have this law is sex discrimination. And if they can get that kind of ruling, it has such impact. And in fact, the justices actually talked about this in the courtroom because one of the justices basically asked the question, so if we side your way, if we go the direction of the Solicitor General and the ACLU, does that mean we're going to essentially constitutionalize the right for boys to play in girls' sports? And we know with that comes locker rooms and all the other things about privacy spaces. And I laughed because their side kind of had to, they know what they're up against in the types of Supreme Court justices we have. And they literally kind of had to say, well, there's a way you can go our way without having to decide that. You can make a very narrow decision because they know the public does not stand with that. But also, there's no way you can interpret the Constitution to require boys to play in girls' sports. That would defy everything we know to be logical.
And there's a real medical component to this that came up a lot in the court hearing, because we're seeing more and more information about the risk involved with this and the actual harm. So whether it's lifelong infertility because you have blocked, puberty at too early of an age, or, bone density, we're seeing now more information coming out about actual cancer risk. So obviously, I think the justices, at least the conservative ones, they didn't want to be responsible for this top-down mandate on this medical issue that's still unsettled, right?
Yeah, I mean, the questioning and the comments lent to the direction of, is it really the appropriate place of the court to make these kind of medical judgments? Or is that exactly what a legislature is supposed to do, is figure out how they need to protect kids and weigh all the evidence? That's not really the role of the court. And I think that is why I do think we saw some positive comments out of them.
Yeah. Do you agree that if we had a worse court, would there be a risk of Roe v. Wading, so to speak, the transgender issue?
Oh, I have no doubt that we are so fortunate to have original justices that are originalists, that look at the Constitution as it actually is and don't try to invent new rights out of it. Because when you have a living, breathing Constitution, justices that have that perspective, they create new rights. And transgenderism clearly was not intended to be its own right. And yes, if you head down this road, it's not just this law. It is the whole of all the issues that surround. We no longer know what a male is and a female is, and we are no longer allowed to consider them as distinctive.
Yeah. And to that point, you had the Biden administration and the ACLU lawyers joining forces on this case to take this argument to the Supreme Court. So that was really interesting to see that, them trying to stop states from being able to protect kids from this kind of experimentation with gender. Now, Victoria, you were there that day. You spoke outside the court as this hearing was going on. So I want to hear from you, kind of that bird's eye view. What was happening that day? What stood out to you? What was that like?
Well, I think it was, in many ways, as you might expect, a little bit of a circus. So both sides have basically, if you want to call them competing rallies or side by side microphones and bullhorns, and kind of trying to put forward the message of their side. And so, and of course, you have the flags and the signage and, everything that you would expect. But I thought on our side, it was interesting. Just this issue brings forward an interesting set of allies who all are in agreement over this particular issue, but might not agree on other things. So, of course, you had the pro-family groups like our organization who have been out there protecting children for decades. But you also had Wolf, which is a women's liberation feminist kind of group. So, we might not align on other issues depending on what they're supporting, but they're here on this because they feel like this is an abuse of what women's rights actually was intended to be. And then you have a group called Gays Against Groomers. So obviously the Family Foundation and those individuals wouldn't agree on the issues of marriage and some of those things, but they also see this as harmful for children. So I think it's just an interesting scenario outside the court. And then of course you had some, I don't know if you want to call them celebrity folks that were there. Most folks know Chloe Cole, who's really been able to platform her story because she really has a very difficult story of being a detransitioner. And we could talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, we had her on the podcast before.
Yes, we've had her on our show before. And then you had Matt Walsh. So a lot of folks follow Daily Wire and follow him specifically. So he was there. And then, of course, just the entire scene outside of the courtroom got more audience because for the first time, and we wouldn't have seen this a few years ago, you had Elon Musk actually live streaming all the speeches. And of course, that audience is just overwhelming. So we're able to get our message out further.
Yeah, I will say it was really fun to see you, as you were speaking, being live streamed on Elon Musk's channel, reaching over 5 million people. So that was just a great moment. And I'm so glad that he is choosing to bring attention to this issue of this risk of harm to kids. And that's why we see kind of the strange bedfellows as you were describing, because people are uniting on let's not harm our kids. We don't have enough evidence. With this, we even have evidence of harm. So, yeah, I think that was just an interesting dynamic there. And I will mention also, it was interesting, you have detransitioners outside giving their testimony being pushed into this at too young of an age. And at the same time, you have the corporate media making a big deal out of the fact that inside the courtroom, the ACLU's lead lawyer on this is a transgender person. A biological woman presenting as a male, arguing to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's interesting because typically in a Supreme Court, it's not about who is doing the talking. It's about the arguments put forward. But in this case, the left is big on this, the intersectionality, the idea that the person, what race, what gender, what sexuality. And so they made that a big deal. And sometimes I think that actually takes away from what they're trying to do, they try to put the emphasis there.
Yeah. I'm just going to say the elephant in the room that this person presenting for the ACLU is identifying as a man. But when you hear the recording, I'm just going to say it's obviously a woman speaking. So it almost sort of maybe to all of the outside world makes the point, right? I mean, I'm just going to say
that's what I wonder. I wonder if it was, I guess they were trying to show how important it is. And I guess they were trying to maybe present why there's so much passion and put somebody like an actual person right in front of them. But I'm not convinced that it didn't, again, make it like this is actually just for you all an emotional thing. It's not really about the facts and the arguments.
Yeah. Interesting.
I don't know.
Well, tell us again why this is considered to be such a landmark historical precedent that's happening right now.
Yeah, because we have in our country right now, we have a $1 billion industry that is literally thriving off of vulnerable kids. These kids can't possibly know the outcome of what will happen. They can't possibly actually give informed consent. At 15, you can't possibly know that you're willing to never have children again because you just have not even gotten to the age of maturity. And so there's just this devastation around that. And, we just sit there and watch this and know this experimentation has to stop. It has to stop. And we have got to not have generations of these kids who have been harmed. And again, outside the courtroom, having the detransitioners there, I think obviously put an exclamation point on that. But again, it's so important because this has been allowed to kind of continue. And we now have over half of the states in the country saying we got to put a stop to this.
Yeah. And I think the justices themselves are very well of all those dynamics with just the science being, showing that there's more risk than harm. And that was a lot of the discussion in the courtroom. And so, most of the justices, it seemed like, were really wanting to shy away from doing any kind of a top-down mandate from the court when you have children and medical issues involved, that it should be left up to the states. And so to that point, I just want to bring up what we're calling some of the jaw-dropping moments that day in the courtroom that really illustrate some of the points that you and I are making, Victoria. And so I'm just going to start with jaw-dropping moment number one. And that was the moment that Justice Sotomayor decided to compare the risk of gender transition procedures, even surgeries, to that of taking an aspirin. Let's just listen for a moment to that.
Cannot eliminate the risk of detransitioners. So it becomes a pure exercise of weighing benefits versus risk. And the question of how many minors have to have their bodies irreparably harmed for unproven benefits is one that is best left.
I'm sorry, counselor. Every medical treatment has a risk, even taking aspirin. There is always going to be a percentage of the population under any medical treatment that's going to suffer a harm. So the question in my mind is not, do policymakers decide whether one person's life is more valuable than the millions of others who get relief from this treatment? The question is, can you stop one sex from the other?
Okay, Victoria, I can't wait for you to weigh in on comparing actually removing children's bodily organs to make them into a different gender to taking an aspirin.
I mean, something that's almost like, how do you even respond? Because it just should never have been said. In my opinion, that was below the dignity of the court, because everyone knows that those two things should never be considered apples to apples. So you look up side effects of an aspirin and it's like, you might be nauseous. You might have a headache. I don't know. It's ridiculous. Like, they're temporary and non-serious and rare. And then you look at, when we're talking about drugs and things and mutilization, where you will never again be able to, fertility is the one that really just jumps out at me. It's like, how could you compare those two things? But again,
lifelong fertility,
right?
I mean, infertility.
Yes, infertility. I mean, and how can you compare those two things? But I think the left has been going to this thing about the aspirin, and it's just like, it just rolls off their tongue now. It's like, we did this with the chemical abortion. Oh, taking a chemical abortion is just like taking an aspirin. And now we're saying cutting off your body parts, just like taking an aspirin. Nope, not the same.
Yeah. And I almost felt like maybe she had to do that in a sense because so much of the hearing was bringing out the fact that there are so many risks more than benefits for kids, underage kids. And so it's almost like she had to say something to kind of bring that, distract from that issue or belittle it or, kind of de-escalate that down. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. There was so much discussion about real harm that you have to figure out it's like she had to counter it, which justices shouldn't feel the need to counter arguments. That's why you have two sides in a courtroom. But it felt almost like she needed to minimize the harms in order to, and yes, of course, everything has risks, but that doesn't mean you say all risks are equal. It means you say some have very small risks, some have very big risks, and that matters. And I'm glad that that's why other justices were like, this isn't really the role of the court to weigh the level of risk. That's what a legislature does. They bring in experts. They hear anyway.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, let's go to jaw-dropping moment number 2. And that is when Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson tried to compare the Tennessee law to banning interracial marriage. Let's just listen to that.
They sound in the same kinds of arguments that were made back in the day, 50s, 60s, with respect to racial classifications and inconsistencies. I'm thinking in particular about Loving, and I'm wondering whether you've thought about the parallels, because I see one, as to how this statute operates and how the anti-miscegenation statutes in Virginia operated.
Okay, Victoria, that just seems like such a big stretch, and I think to a lot of people listening to her try to make that connection just sounds like a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo. But help us understand the case she's trying to make here.
I mean, in a nutshell, it's basically they're trying to claim that banning these drugs is sex discrimination. And she's trying to say, well, it's just like racial discrimination. It's just the comparison just falls flat. And it feels a little... I feel like whenever the left is trying to make something that we are doing seem terrible, they run to racism, because of course we all know how terrible our country's history is on racism and on things like interracial marriage. But it just feels like it's an attempt to emotionally pull someone in and say, see, this thing, which in this case is banning surgeries and puberty blockers for children is just like this terrible thing of the past. And it allows us to get kind of put in a bucket of like, oh, those bigots. Like that's what it feels like. I'm not saying she wasn't trying to make a legitimate argument. Maybe she was, but I just am tired. I feel like that comes out in places where it looks like it's almost shoehorned into a discussion in order to point a finger and call someone a name without directly, you're not going to have a Supreme Court justice like that actually say, well, these people are a bunch of bigots, but it feels like that's what you're trying to infer.
Yeah. And that's also the problem when you try to make something that changes in the same constitutionally protected category as an immutable characteristic, which, as demonstrated by the detransitioners, it is not immutable.
Yes. And I think that's a really important distinction here, because discrimination, there used to be a class of, a Supreme Court test of sort of what meets the standards of a discriminatory, like a class that has been discriminated on. And it was that something is immutable, that it's unchangeable. And therefore I couldn't change it if I want to. And so the whole thing is this bizarre conversation that they're having. And I think, honestly, bringing that in was just out of context.
Okay, and I think we have to point out that this particular justice is the same one that said in her nomination hearing that she could not define what a woman is because she's not a biologist. And so now she's trying to speak into biology.
Yeah, I feel like she made such a point about that when going through confirmation. I feel like we should honestly tell her, well, you need to recuse yourself because this whole case is about what is a woman? What is a man? Can a woman become a man? Can we give drugs? I think she just obviously, she said she was not qualified in confirmation. I think she should have been disqualified to make a decision in this case, but that's not a legal opinion.
I totally agree, 100%. Well, the good news is the Tennessee attorney, Matthew Rice, defending his state's law to protect kids in this, he did a masterful job explaining that this law is based on the impact of medical treatments, like medical diagnosis, medical treatments, accurately addressing that, not discrimination. So let's just listen to him for a moment.
Giving testosterone to a boy with a deficiency is not the same treatment as giving it to a girl who has psychological distress associated with her body. This is not only
what's your basis for saying that? I'm sorry. Is it just because of why they're asking for it, or is there some kind of medical? I took the SG to be saying that it operates on the body in the same way. So what's your basis for saying they're not the same?
I don't think it operates on the body in the same way. Take testosterone. If you give a boy with a deficiency testosterone because he has constitutional delayed puberty, that allows him to go through and develop the reproductive organs associated with being a male. If you give it to a girl, it renders the girl infertile.
It almost seems like there's a double take there by the attorney. It's like, are you kidding me? You're trying to claim that this drug given to a male is the same as given to a female, when for men, it has one effect, but for women, it actually would make a woman infertile. And he's going, wait, this is about the purpose that you're using the drug for, not about the person that you're giving it to. And so I think he did an excellent job.
It was almost a laughable, bizarre moment because she asked, what is the difference? And he says, well, it's that the woman will be infertile. So he just, one of those moments like, are we actually having this conversation at the Supreme Court level?
Well, and I mean, everyone knows that drugs are designed to affect a specific thing, and you can't just use them willy-nilly for other purposes, right? Like that's every drug that the FDA looks at. Is this going to be prescribed for this reason? And there's what we call off-label use, which is, when people are trying to use it in some other way. And so it's supposed to bizarre idea that they're trying to kind of act like, because you use it in one sex, you should be able to use it for the other for any purpose.
Yeah. All right. Let's get to the third jaw-dropping moment. And one of the stars coming out of this was definitely Justice Alito. He was just so well prepared, more than the other attorneys, the ACLU Biden attorneys. And he just eviscerated their arguments, trying to make two claims. One, that what they call gender-affirming procedures actually have documented proof of reducing the risk of suicide. And two, they made this really blanket claim that there's overwhelming evidence that it helps youth. And he took that straight on. Let's just listen to that.
General, can I ask you a question about the state of medical evidence at the present time? In your petition, you made a sweeping statement, which I will quote. Overwhelming evidence establishes that the appropriate gender-affirming treatment with puberty blockers and hormones directly and substantially improves the physical, psychological well-being of transgender adolescents with gender dysphoria. That was in November 2023. Now, even before then, the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare wrote the following. They currently assess, quote, that the risks of puberty blockers and gender-affirming treatment are likely to outweigh the expected benefits of these treatments, which is directly contrary to the sweeping statement in your petition. After the filing of your petition, of course, we saw the release of the CAS report in the United Kingdom, which found a complete lack of high-quality evidence showing that the benefits of the treatments in question here outweigh the risks. And so I wonder if you would like to stand by the statement that you made in your petition, or if you think it would now be appropriate to modify that and withdraw the statement that there is overwhelming evidence establishing that these treatments have benefits that greatly outweigh the risks and the dangers.
I, of course, acknowledge, Justice Alito, that there is a lot of debate happening here and abroad about the proper model of delivery of this care and exactly when adolescents should receive it and how to identify the adolescents for whom it would be helpful.
I just so appreciate his he's just a masterful questioner and sort of his response about these things, because they're trying to claim there is just unified consensus about that this is better for kids than not doing it. And everybody knows that's absolutely not the case. And I think it's great that we sort of draw out this issue of like, look, Europe led the way on this. And now they're backtracking because they realized it was experimental, that it was actually dangerous. And I appreciate that he went at them for, so there's something called the CAS review. And it's a very important review of these studies and understanding what the actual outcomes are. And it notes, as we heard, that basically the suicide risk is not actually improved by kids jumping on these puberty blockers. And his point was, but you relegated that to a footnote. You barely even acknowledged, you didn't want to sort of bring all the evidence forward. So I just appreciate, because I think, if that kind of important evidence isn't brought forward, this is a different conversation.
Well, as someone that is sitting through a lot of these school board meetings in Virginia, you hear every single time when it comes to involving parents in these gender transition, promotions at school and counselors getting involved. And you hear these LGBTQ activists show up at the school board meeting and oppose parents being involved. And what they say all the time is the suicide risk. And now you have been documented at the Supreme Court level. Actually, there's no evidence. So
I think that's really important that it was documented in this courtroom. I think also really important is just understanding that is the line that even parents who are well-intentioned, struggling through this with their kids, they show up at a medical professional's office and they get told, do you want this is the sort of the famous line, but do you want a dead daughter or a live son? It's like, these are your options, as if it's one road or the other. And we know that it's just not that simple. So I think that's really, really important. And of course, the detransitioners testified to that.
Yeah. Tell us about that, because you were right there beside them when they were talking.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we heard from Chloe Cole, but there were also others whose stories haven't been maybe as widely heard as Chloe's. There was a young woman named Presha who talks about how she was actually put on testosterone at the age of 17 and given a double mastectomy. And let's just go ahead and play a little bit of that clip so you can hear her story.
I wasn't given evidence or ethical treatment. I was medicalized based on pseudoscience and the singular fact that I hated myself. The effects of the drugs and the surgery I was given are not reversible. I'm still dealing with new complications and even learning about how my body was harmed. I believed the lies my doctors told me and activists like the ones trying to hide my voice from you because I was vulnerable. I was vulnerable from abuse and trauma. By the time I was 14, I had been raped, I became pregnant, and suffered a miscarriage. By 16, I had been diagnosed with anxiety, OCD, and with borderline personality disorder, with hospitalizations for depression and anorexia. I tried to kill myself several times. A medical resident talked with me once and suddenly decided, despite all of my other documented physical and mental struggles, that my real trouble was a gender identity crisis.
Well, that just truly is heartbreaking when you hear a story like hers, especially where she's saying all of these things were happening in her life, rape, all kinds of heavy trauma. And this medical consultant isn't even helping her deal with all that, just putting her on this fast track and immediately labeling this as you're having a gender identity crisis. And that's just what's happening way too much of the time.
That I hate to say it, that is a thread you hear in a lot of these stories, that there has been abuse or there is a situation, there are other things playing into their struggle. And it seems like what's been happening is they're showing up in a medical professional's office and they've got all these things going on. And then all of a sudden, the counselor or whoever goes right into, it must be gender dysphoria. You must be actually a boy in a girl's body or whatever. And the next thing you know, nothing else is being looked at. And it's this very myopic approach. And it's just devastating.
And it's even more dangerous since we know there is this contagion being caused by the social media and being pushed in the schools.
Yes, also that we cannot ignore the numbers speak for themselves, that there's nothing that would automatically create this burst of kids who think they're transgender, except that we've been, again, sort of like creating this ideology, pushing it early in schools, and kids are getting confused by the confusion we are creating as a society around gender.
Well, one thing I loved about your speech at the hearing was that you brought in that this is being motivated, the desire to protect kids that everybody's unifying on is being motivated by love, by compassion. And you spoke from your heart as a mom. Tell us a little bit about what you were trying to say in that regard.
Yeah, I think it was just really important that a lot of times those of us that are engaging in this, are told that we're being hateful, that this is about disliking someone else, about being mean to someone else. And in reality, it is actually motivated from exactly the opposite place. It is the most loving thing we can possibly do to care for children and to protect them from misguided adults, from medical experimentation. That is love. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that out, that as a mom of kids, we want our children to be confident in the bodies that God has given them, to embrace the beauty of their gender, and to be able to stand up against adults that are just confused about this and pushing something on them. And so it is actually out of the exact opposite place that we fight for these kids.
Well, one of my favorite moments of your speech was this G.K. Chesterton quote that I just want to share with people because it encapsulates exactly what you were saying there. So it so well summarizes. So you said, quote, "The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him." I just thought that was a beautiful way to summarize there.
Well, there are wiser people than I that have put it much more eloquently. But yes, I mean, the narrative that our side is somehow not in this for the kids to protect them is tiresome. And we have to kind of constantly remind people that it is, in fact, about love. And I think we will look back and it will be reflected that this was the group out there protecting kids from literal experimentation, science, pseudoscience, masking as something more than that.
Yeah. And even though they always say they want to follow the science, they don't want to in this case, which was made clear in that court hearing.
No question. And the detransitioners that are out there telling their stories are speaking to that this was pseudoscience, that their lives will never be the same because they were not protected. And I'm pleased to see not only were they on the outside of the courtroom, but they also were acknowledged on the inside of the courtroom that yes, there is this group of people that have been truly harmed by this, and we can't ignore that. And the ACLU and the Solicitor General, they can't run right past that because these people are real. And I think for so long, when this transgender stuff kind of came on the forefront, it was almost like people were going to pretend that doesn't exist, that no one ever regrets it, that there's never. And I think it's just good for them to have their stories start to come out both outside the courtroom with Elon Musk streaming them, and also inside the courtroom with the court justices acknowledging this is real. We have to pay attention to this. So that's another piece of this.
Yeah. And again, that was Alito. He asked, are there people, essentially he asked, are there people that have changed? And they had to acknowledge, yes, there are. So that's also public, on the record too. So yes, he was one of the heroes coming out of this. Well, what happens now, Victoria?
Well, we're, sitting here in the month of December, and, our society, we're used to things really quick. So, it's like, are they going to decide right away? Well, no, the way the Supreme Court works is it will be months. We will probably get the actual decision probably in June is typical. And so we'll kind of wait, and we'll be praying for them as they contemplate everything they've heard. They look at all the briefs. Again, I mentioned that we had signed on. I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't, but that we had signed on onto an amicus brief. And the reason that we did that as Virginia is because we want to preserve that right to be able to have that kind of bill, because there's impact for our state. Maybe we should unpack that maybe a little bit.
Yeah. Go ahead. Please tell us, how does this impact Virginia families and what's happening, in our medical professions, our schools?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is not only is Virginia, I would argue that our government is complicit in this experimentation. And the reason I say that at our state is not only have we not passed a do no harm or help not harm bill, something to protect the kids, but we've also been we've allowed the craziness into the lower schools, into these young ages. As you know, we've been fighting that in every community with our Speak Up teams, dealing with the Protect Every Kid campaign of like, what are we teaching? What kind of books are in front of them? All of that. So we have that going on that we've been battling, but we also have a ban on simple talk therapy that would help a child be able to affirm their God-given gender as it aligns with their biology. And so we won't give them the kind of compassionate care in Virginia. We're literally banned, illegal, from giving them the kind of compassionate care that would prevent them from thinking that they should move forward with puberty blockers and surgeries. So it's real important for our state as we try to correct the path that we've been on.
Yeah, I just find that interesting because they are banning freedom. They are banning that they can have the freedom to choose a different kind of counseling. You can only have one kind of counseling. So,
well, they think the talk is so harmful, but they don't think the surgeries are harmful. Ponder that for a second. Their side really believes that a conversation about this is going to be detrimentally harmful to a child. And our government has agreed with them in the sense that they passed a law, but they don't think that it's a problem for kids to be on experimental drugs and actually go through surgeries.
Wow, that is an astute point. And all I can say is, Lord, have mercy on us in our state and help us turn this around. And to that point, how can people continue being involved if they want to be involved in what's happening in this legislative session? Because I know Family Foundation is going to bring forward some legislation, right, to try to rectify this.
Yes, we will absolutely have a do no harm bill. We will be working on boys and girls sports. So many of these issues we will be working to see if we can get. I do think there's a moment in our country right now where people are starting to wake up and realize this is a problem. Maybe our legislature can come along and actually listen to the people that I think spoke loudly in the election about this and this court case and all of that. So we have these bills moving forward. We do need people. If you want to be hearing about this and be engaged and be helpful on this, you probably need to be on our email alert list. So you can get that on our Family Foundation website. So familyfoundation.org. There's a box, just sign up for the email. And that's how you get the up-to-date information about what the bill is, where it's passing through, when your legislator will actually be considering it. And we make it as easy as possible for people to just send in to their legislator. You don't have to know who they are. We help you with that, but just send in your concern about these kind of things that are moving forward with our, the concern around transgender issues for our kids.
Yeah, and we're going to have text alerts too through that that will give you moment-to-moment alerts when it's actually being heard. So, yeah. People have been optimistic that we might get a good ruling on this. If that happens, do you think that will make it easier for us to get through some kind of do no harm legislation in Virginia moving forward?
I do think that both the sort of left-leaning analysis that's out there and what you would call the right-leaning analysis are saying we think that the questioning and the conversation in the court is in a good place, that they might uphold this Tennessee law. Like both sides, one's worried about that, one's happy about that, but they're kind of, that seems to be the consensus. So that's what we're hoping will happen. And I do think if that happens, at a minimum, when we move forward with our efforts with the bill, they can't attempt to tell us, oh, this is going to be unconstitutional or this is discriminatory in some way. Now, again, we won't have a ruling before this session unless the Supreme Court does something totally uncharacteristic. So we will have to remind them of how these discussions went in the courtroom. But should we not pass it this year, I'd love to see that we get a great ruling here, and that helps fortify our efforts in a future year.
Well, that's a perfect place to wrap up. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I invite you to join us next time when we will hopefully have a working camera again. And in the meantime, share our playlist. Just one more plug for that. Speak Up Virginia playlist. Share that so we can let people know what's really happening on these gender identity issues in our kids. Remember, we are stronger when we speak together, and we'll see you next time.